Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be covering a section from grade 11, lesson 4. This is the section on musical instruments. Basically we are learning about musical instruments as a continuation of our topic on sound waves, because musical instruments are instruments that make sound waves of different types. So basically, when we talk about musical instruments, there are three categories of musical instruments. Now, you all know different examples of musical instruments, right? And these include cymbals, clarinets, horns, drums, flutes, violins, pianos, guitars, right? Tuba, saxophone, all of these are different examples of musical instruments. And if you take all of these instruments, they can be put into one of three categories. So there are three categories called the string instruments, and the percussion instruments, and the wind instruments. So these are the three categories of musical instruments, and we're going to go into detail about each of these categories. So we're starting off with the string instruments. Now, what are string instruments? They are instruments in which sound is generated by vibrating a string. So let's say that we have a musical instrument such as this violin, and to make a sound, we need to vibrate a string on this. Now you can see that the violin has strings that are stretched across its body. So if you need to make the sound by vibrating a string, then this would be called a string instrument. So what are some other examples of string instruments? Some other examples are the guitar, the sitar, and so on. So in string instruments, if you make a sound, the pitch of the sound that you make would depend on three factors. Now, this is the part that you need to focus on. There are three factors that determine the pitch of a sound that you make with a string instrument. Now, the first factor is the length of the string. If you happen to vibrate a long string, and if you happen to vibrate a shorter string, the sound that you make from a long string would be different to the sound that you make from a short string. So the pitch of these two sounds would be completely different. So one factor that affects the sound, the pitch of a sound made by a string instrument, is the length of the string. Now, the second factor is the tension of the string. Now, we know that in string instrument, there are these pegs on one end, and through these pegs, you can either increase the tension or decrease the tension. So basically, you can either tighten the strings more or you can loosen the strings. Now, by changing the tension, let's say you make a sound through when it's at high tension, and you make another sound when it's at a lesser tension, the pitch of the two sounds, when the tension changes, the pitch of the sound would definitely change. So that is the second factor that affects the pitch of a sound made by a string instrument. This is the tension of the string. And the third factor that affects the tension, the third factor that affects the pitch made by a string instrument is the mass of a unit length of the string. You see, there are different strings of different thicknesses. So for example, this over here is a string having a high thickness, and this over here is a string having a low thickness. So if you take this very thick string, if you take a unit length of this, a unit length of a thick string would have a high mass, right? It has a high mass per unit length. But if you happen to take the same length of this thin string, this would have a low mass per unit length. And if you make a sound from this string and this thinner string, you would notice how the pitch of the two sounds would be completely different. So the third factor that affects the pitch of a sound made by a string instrument is the mass of a unit length of the string. Or in simple, you can remember mass of a unit length as the thickness of the string. When the thickness changes, the pitch of the sound too would change. So that is all you need to know about the string instruments. You need to know what a string instrument is. You need to learn a few examples of string instruments. And finally, you need to know the factors that determine the pitch of a sound made by a string instrument. So next up, we are moving on to the second category of musical instruments, which are the percussion instruments. Now, what are percussion instruments? They are instruments in which sound is generated by vibrating a stretched membrane or by vibrating metal plates. So examples for percussion instruments include drums, cymbals, and xylophones. Now, if you look at a drum has a stretched membrane, and you make the sound by vibrating this stretched membrane. When you hit a drum, you are vibrating this stretched membrane, and that's what generates the sound. Then in cymbals and in xylophones, you have metal plates, and by vibrating the metal plates, you make a sound. So any instrument where the sound is generated by vibrating a stretched membrane or a metal plate is what we call a percussion instrument. Now, here's the important part. In a percussion instrument, the pitch depends on two factors. There are two factors that determine the pitch of a sound made by a percussion instrument. So to understand this, let's consider the drum. There are two factors that affect the pitch of a sound made by a drum. The first factor is the area of the membrane. If you take a drum where there's a smaller area of a membrane and you vibrate this, you make a sound by hitting this. And you take a larger drum with a larger area and you make a sound with this, you would notice that the sound made by the smaller area is completely different to the sound made by the larger area. So the area of the membrane is one factor that affects the pitch. When the area changes, the pitch of the sound that you make would also be different. Then the second factor that affects the pitch of a sound made by a percussion instrument is the tension of the membrane. Now, just what we saw in the string instruments, even in drums, even in percussion instruments such as the drum, there are these little pegs on the side which allow you to change the tension. So by changing the tension, if you make the membrane tighter or looser, and if you make two sounds on a higher tension and a lower tension, you would notice that the pitch changes. So the second factor that affects the pitch of a sound made by a percussion instrument is the tension of the membrane. So this is the most important part. You need to keep in mind the two factors that determine the pitch of a sound made by a percussion instrument. So with this, we are moving on to the third type of musical instruments, which are the wind instruments. Now, what are wind instruments? They are the instruments in which sound is generated by vibrating an air column. And an example is a saxophone. So what happens in a saxophone? The player blows in, and when the player blows in, the air column inside this instrument is made to vibrate, and by vibrating this air column, you get the sound of the saxophone. So any instrument in which the sound is generated by vibrating an air column is called a wind instrument. And examples include saxophone, clarinet, trumpet, flute, etc. Now, when we talk about a wind instrument, the pitch of the sound made by a wind instrument depends on one factor. And that factor is the length of the air column. So let's imagine you have a flute like this. The only factor that affects the pitch of your sound is the length of the air column. So let's say this player blows in from this part. So this is where the player blows in. And let's say that all these holes are covered with the player's fingers, except for the last one. So that would mean that the air blown in would have to go all the way to this end in order to come out, right? So we say that this is the length of the air column. So the only factor that changes the pitch of the sound made is the length of the air column. And that is why when you have a person playing a wind instrument, you'd see his or her fingers constantly moving to change the lengths within that particular instrument. Because when the length of the air column changes, that is when the pitch of the sound would change. So that is all you'll need to learn about for this topic of musical instruments. In summary, you need to know what the three categories are. They are the string instruments, the percussion instruments, and the wind instruments. And for each category, you need to know how the sound is generated, and you need to learn about 2 or 3 examples for each category. And most importantly, you need to learn for each category the factors that determine the pitch made by a sound, the pitch of a sound made by that particular instrument. So for the string instruments, right at the start, we learned that the pitch of the sound depends on 3 factors. Then for percussion instruments, we've learned that the pitch of the sound depends on 2 factors. And here in the wind instruments, we've learned that the pitch of the sound depends on only 1 factor. So this is the most important part that you need to focus on. So with this, we have come to the end of this section and the end of this video. I hope all of you got a good understanding on this topic. Thank you.